All right. Apparently that thing delayed me out 10 seconds, so now we're actually live. Episode 10, Dillon Damuth, Gecko Labs on Instagram and geckolaboratory.com. Thanks for hanging out with me tonight, man. I really appreciate it. And you have
Yeah, of
an
course. Thanks for
awesome
reaching out.
background already.
Yeah, one I just completed this viv a couple of weeks ago, but houses a group of Gastrophilis prasina, the green-keeled uh, lizards.
Killer.
Assume they're all sleeping since they're not bouncing around behind me.
So, pretty basic format. It's like we were talking about before we went live. No heavy lift on the questions. I just like to hang out and kind of talk collections. I have been checking out your website and following you on your personal Facebook, seeing a bunch of stuff, and then I actually, right before we started this, came across your Instagram, of course, which was $1 late, $1 short and a day late. But no, just following you on Facebook, man. You have an extensive collection of lizards, all sorts of different things. You obviously are really serious about your enclosures. All your pictures are always really awesome, and then you start off with that enclosure behind you. So clearly, it's setting things up and doing it right and doing bioactive, and it's very important to you, or it seems that way. So yeah, just kind of take us through the collection. What are you keeping? What sparks your interest? What's the Gecko Lab about?
So initially, when I first started keeping like at any serious level, I was doing a lot with eupiliferids. But when I started keeping, it was always kind of the mindset was I'll start with something that I like and kind of breed, sell offspring, build up the funds to gradually get like more obscure things that I like, and kind of work up the ladder and keep things along the way or move them if I'm not really a fan of them any longer, or if they're not really keeping my engagement level of the collection. And so through the years, like the room that I'm in now, like is primarily just everything that we work with, like on a commercial basis, like stuff that we'll actually sell. So this room houses the gastros. Up above them is a pair of Varanus kingorum. Over in the other corner is a pair of Tenosora bakeri, and an entire wall of crusteds. And then we have in here too the Digrenia stokesi, which we just had little babies from just a couple of days ago. So this one I think is around a week old now.
That's amazing.
Tiny little nugget. But yeah, so over the years, what really kind of piqued and held my interest was the stuff that was oviviviparous, so the live bearing species. But like I am a snake person, but not to the point where like I want to keep a ton of them, even though like I could keep thousands of them in the space that I have currently. If I did it the typical standard way. But so I do have a pair of Dumerals boas. Those were gifted to me from a friend a couple years ago, and I've passively like kind of cycled them and tried to get into the pair for a couple of years. But last year, especially, like I caught them locking, and it seemed like I was good. And then like I didn't put much effort into like any of like the care to ensure everything went well after that, because after I paired them I was like I don't have room to rear a litter of boas, especially like being Dumerals I would be inclined to just keep them all, and so I was like I'm gonna keep feeding her but a little more scarce and hopefully she'll just resorb, and that seemed to be the case, but she's still hardy, big, and very angry all the time. But yeah, so like oviviviparous stuff is like what really gets my gears going, especially for like the more obscure stuff. Like the other room that we have, it's primarily all cold temperature stuff. So we keep that pretty much everything as if it's in like cloud forest temperatures. So that room has all of the Abronia, the Sri Lankan agamids, the night lizards, the Beresia, the Misaspis. What else is in there? right now it has our pair of Varanus Beckeri until we move them into this room. But I have an enclosure up to the left that I'm working on finishing hopefully this week. But yeah, so a lot of miscellaneous things. The primary thing that we've been working with and building up like the numbers and quality of has been the crested geckos and other New Caledonian species. Um, and those are primarily something that like my better half really likes. So I was like, all right. So I used to have a ton of eubliferids, which needed like the extra heat sources and everything. Whereas like right now, I'm nowhere near content like how we have the crested house because we use simple tub setups because they're all breeders. And but like we started planning out moving hopefully this fall and planning out like the layout for facility, which right now we're tentatively planning on doing a hopefully a 30-foot by 40-foot outbuilding that we can split into 3 climate controlled rooms. And that way we can just have one room specifically for the cresteds where all of the breeders are going to have 18 or 16 by 18 by 24 PVCs that are going to be under UVB. And still not 100% on whether I'll put those on bioactive just because that's something that we actually have to dig for the eggs. But I'll probably at the very least give them like cocoa husk and everything to help keep the humidity up. But they'll all be on misters and everything at that point because they're one of the very few things that we're still manually misting. Everything else is on Mist Kings at this point.
Okay.
Which is great, but also like now I have to fill a 5-gallon reservoir every 36 hours. So.
Yep.
But it saves from carrying around a 4-gallon backpack, so that's fine.
So when you're talking about having 2 different rooms now, for the other room, are you just using like central air? Do you have an air conditioner set for that? How are you making that a colder cloud forest room? As opposed
so we do have central air. We keep it during the day set to kind of maintain between 63 and 67. And like this room's on it too, but because this room also has all the enclosures that require heating elements, this room by default doesn't get as cold.
Okay.
And thankfully, like the thermostat's not actually in this room, so it's not driving the AC to continually be on. So this room ambient sits around like 78 to 82 during the day. Okay. Which for any of the crusty mommies listening that are like, oh no, that's too hot. It's not. They're kept at 82 for 7-8 hours a day, then they drop down at night to 68. They're fine. And we actually get fantastic growth rates on the juveniles between the temperatures, the humidity, and we offer live bugs usually twice a week. Okay. But yeah, the other room, there's barely any heating elements. There's just all the UV lights. So that room ambient sits during the day usually around like 72. And then if they go up near the lights, the top of the enclosures are usually around like 82 to 84. So they do have that thermal gradient. I also have LED puck lights, so that usually bumps it up to around like 86-ish right underneath that. But I don't see them utilizing that terribly often, so I don't give them anything warmer than that because otherwise like it's not going to get used anyway.
Right. So then you were just talking about Mist Kings in general, but are you running a humidifier in that room for the room itself, or are you just individually per enclosure misting? So
both of the rooms we do have humidifiers running in the room in general, especially this room because it has the heating element, so it dries out quicker. The other room, which I should probably switch the humidifiers because the one in the other room has a much larger reservoir. So that one, like I can leave on all week long and it's fine because I just have it set to maintain like 75. And with the Mist King going off all the time, it has no problem doing that. Whereas this one's, I think, only a 1 or 1.5 gallon reservoir. So this one, like I have to fill daily. But yeah, so Mist Kings plus humidifiers. So usually walking into a room is like actually walking into a forest, which is fantastic.
For sure. So why live bears? Do you want the instant gratification? You don't want to wait for them to crack out, or what drove that to your interest in that?
So the primary thing was kind of how little we know about them. Um, and it's like they've been studied and whatever, and we can know like rough seasonalities and stuff, but we really don't know like what makes them tick reproductively, especially how to get those ticks to kind of trigger in captivity for a lot of the more obscure stuff like the abronia. And thankfully, like I have a great working relationship with our vet, and he's also very drawn to reproductive physiology. Um, so I kind of benefit a lot there. I've during the pandemic, I've tried not to bother him too much, but we have brought in a handful of Abronia on a handful of occasions to do ultrasounds at various points of the season to see when follicles are developing, where they're positioned during those times, so on and so forth. But yeah, so it's more so of trying to figure out like what makes them tick, because like I have plenty enough stuff that's here that's just easy and anybody can slap them together and do it. I like challenges.
Yeah, I get it. You've got a pretty diverse size range for things that you just listed out, whereas it seems like a lot of your stuff is smaller, and then you randomly, as you were listing things off, threw in Bakery and tree monitors and like just little slips in there of like, oh no, those are totally different. Are those just things, that species caught your eye and you decided to branch out a little more, or it seemed to be kind of farther outside the wheelhouse?
Yeah, so I tend to kind of like find like a genus or a group that I really like and figure out a good starting. But I hate starting with things that are like already overly represented. So the Bakery was a good starting point for Tenosora because they're not bred in really high numbers like the Semillas or Pectinata. Just like I think primarily because there's not a lot of color variation to them. And so the Bakery actually, by happenstance, one of the former vets at the clinic, who was a good friend, he wanted to offload his pair, and so he offered them to us, and I was like, yeah, I'll take them. And they were a pair that he had raised from babies, so they were fairly well socialized, though they, for the longest time, really hated each other. So they've been breeding size for 2 years now, I think, maybe 3. And anytime I tried introducing them, the female just was not having it. No matter what time of year, nothing. She would just beat the crap out of them.
Wow.
And it wasn't for like his lack of trying. Like he was head bobbing, all the courtship behaviors. Like he was doing his best.
Right.
But she just wasn't having it. And so finally, after a while, because I had them set up in neighboring enclosures that had a divider between them, but it was a visual barrier. They couldn't see each other. Okay. And so finally, after a while, I was like, all right, you know what? Like I kept introducing them more frequently outside of the enclosure until they started tolerating each other more. And then finally one day I was like, divider's coming out. Like full stop. You guys are going to get used to each other. Deal with it. And they've been together now. I think I took that divider out probably last summer. So approaching a year now. And they've been perfectly fine. They've been a lot more food aggressive. Like now when I come in the room and they see me holding anything green or red, they will just jump on the door. And if the door is open, they will just instantly jump right out to try and figure out if it's something they can eat. But aside from they've been getting along great, basking together all the time. So hopefully I'm not putting too much effort into them this year because space is limited. I don't want to have to rear a handful of baby iguanas. But hopefully by next year, we'll see some of them on the ground. And the tree monitors, kind of similar story. One of my friends had a pair that was an old F1 that he produced around 13 years ago. Wow. And then a long-term captive male, and he needed to downsize, so he asked me if I wanted them. And he gave me the forewarning, the female's really old, she might not be reproductive. And he's like, so if you don't want her, I understand. I was like, I don't care. And he's like, at least it gives me multiple specimens to get started with the group within Varanids and or within tree monitors and figure out their kind of ticks and go from there to see if it's something that like I want to invest time in as an actual project. I was a bit regardless. I was like, I'll let her live out her life here. Like that's fine. Um, but so and like they grew on me super quick. Their alertness, intelligence levels, everything, and I was just like, all right, well, I guess tree monitors are a thing. And thankfully, right now we don't have the space to add a bunch. Otherwise, one of my friends has had blues and yellows this year as well, and
Oh, awesome.
I was talking about them, and I was like, don't even let me talk to you about them like until we move, because like if I have to build another big enclosure right now, my better half's probably gonna murder me.
Yeah, I have that discussion a lot with my friends, and they still continually offer me things that my spouse is not impressed with. I'm always impressed with it. She disagrees. So we actually have our first question, and Alex would like to know if you still have your Sulawesi celebensis, the hydrosaur.
So I do not. I was an idiot, and I moved them into too large of an enclosure too quickly. Um, and the female actually jumped down from the highest perch one day and landed on her water dish, awkward, and broke her neck.
Whoa.
And yeah, it was rough because they were something that it was my better half's like dream bucket list species. And I came home from it or with them from a show one day and was like, hey, like we sold a couple of your cresteds. Like, so I grabbed this and I only grabbed one because I didn't want her to murder me. But then I told her, I was like, they had two that looked like a pair. And she's like, well, why didn't you get both of them? And I was like, welp. And so I messaged the vendor and I was like, hey, you saw the other one? And he's like, yeah, you want it? And I was like, yeah. He was like, all right, I'll bring it back from this other show with us. I was like, all right, cool. But yeah, we moved him into too large of an enclosure too quickly. And then after the female passed, because the male was a little bit larger, he did well for a little while, and then gradually, like he just went off food. Like everything was fine. Like nothing was up with his fecals. Like he wasn't dehydrated. He was soaking. He was drinking. He was eating. And then randomly out of the blue, he just went off food with no change and anything else. And I don't remember if we brought him in for a Nico or not. I don't think we did because we had brought in for fecals and nothing showed up. But yeah, so that was a bummer. And so then she decided to wait until we're moved so we can like actually build out the stepwise enclosures to really transfer them throughout the growth instead of just like throwing them in a giant one. Okay. But yeah, they're still on the radar, on the list. They're definitely something we'll get again down the road. But right now, between space and her still being a little beat up, but also like I think part of it, like a little bit of not necessarily embarrassment, but I can't think of another word that it happened because it was like something like they looked in great shape, like they were doing great, and then they just weren't.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. Like it's part of keeping, and then like you always feel like you screwed up. Like even if you kept something to being geriatric, you know, and then you know that it passed due to old age or what have you, like you still, you know, you always feel like you messed up somehow, and it just, I get that. I mean, that's understandable.
So like we have a 21-year-old female crested gecko who's gradually dwindling right now. But like she's still actively hunting and stuff. But I feel like at some point, probably this year, we're gonna have to make the decision to let her go peacefully instead of just tanking.
Yeah, I mean that's, you know, kind of part of it, which sucks. But I mean that's kind of a downer note right after something amazing when the start of that sentence was 21-year-old gecko. To most people, that's like mind-blowingly awesome. And it is. That's fantastic. And I don't know. Like I think that it sucks at the time, but it's always like, hey man, I kept that to geriatric phase. Like that's impressive. That's important, to
Yeah.
being a keeper and to the hobby in general, like so that other people know, like, yeah, hey, this is what, end of life care and things like that are about, and folks should know that. But also that this is totally possible because you are doing it currently. Like that's really
Yeah, that's it. Like I feel like in the crested groups all the time, I see people like when they ask like what's the average lifespan, people are always commenting like 10 to 12 years, and I'm just like, if
right.
you do it right, you can get double that. Because like we have other ones that were hatched the same year as her that are still actually laying and producing.
Wow.
And like we have, I think, 5 hatchlings from them from last year, and these are F1 and F2 animals. And so, like, as far as crusteds go, they're genetically invaluable. Like, there's no more coming out of New Caledonia anytime soon.
Right.
At least not without going through the German laundry machines. But
Yeah, that's kind of a thing. Well, there you go. We got one in the comments that just turned 13. That's fantastic.
Good, keep it going.
Yeah. By the way, thanks, Alex. I'm sure you're still listening, for asking the first question and being a major bummer. Good job. Um, no, Alex is a good dude. He hangs out a lot. So with the enclosures, and you're talking about moving and trying to do a building and stuff. Um, what was kind of the driver for that? Do you enjoy the plant side and stuff, or did you just get into building enclosures because you had animals that lend themselves awesomely to bioactive? Like, was it already kind of a hobby, or did it become a necessity with the lizards?
A little bit of both. Even growing up, like when I had miscellaneous stuff, as most of us herp nerds do growing up, they, I always, was trying to find not necessarily cheaper options, but like options that were more gratifying, between building like hides and stuff like that. And it's always kind of gradually developed, and then over the last couple of years, it just kind of really took off. And like to me, like building the enclosures and design, like from conceptualizing them in my head to occasionally I kind of actually sketched them out to be like, all right, this is what I want it roughly to look like. Rarely ends up like that, so I stopped doing it as frequently. um, but the whole like workflow to me is a way for me to escape from like actual work. So I'm a grad student finishing up my PhD, so life is miserable,
Yeah.
especially as a grad student finishing their PhD during a pandemic. Um, but yeah, so especially like the last year, like, or 2 years, I guess, building like the larger enclosures as I got more familiar with the materials and everything, just kind of took off. So like we're probably going to Home Depot 2-3 times a week at this point, and the cashiers have stopped asking questions. um, I think one of the first trips we made, we were getting probably like 20 sheets of PVC, and he was like, "Oh, like you redoing like a bathroom?" And I was like, "No, I'm building lizard enclosures." And he was like, "Oh, okay." And then like one of the other cashiers overheard, and he's like, "Oh, my son has an iguana," and I was like, "Oh, here we go."
Yeah.
Um,
Now you're that guy.
like, yep. So now every time I go and he sees us, and he's like, "Oh, more materials." I'm like, yes, that's the only thing I come here for. Um, but yeah, so it just kind of like skyrocketed from there. It's something that like I really enjoyed doing. Like this enclosure behind me, like I've redone a couple of times, and then finally it's at a point where I'm more content with it. Probably still won't be entirely until I get the plants grown in more. The Scheffleras are taking a little shock to getting moved in, but they're still shooting off new growth. Just the old growth is sad. So,
Right.
but yeah, so for a while I had probably three 4 foot by 2 foot by 4 foot enclosures that were all in various states of limbo in the living room, and they got to the point where the better half was like, "Hey, finish these or throw them out," and I was like, let's go to Home Depot," and so I finished most of them up except for the tree monitor one over the course of like a week, and now that's the only one I have left to do. So I have an elevated nest box that I'm building that's
Awesome.
currently has the probably second to last coat of drying on it right now, and then that'll get mounted up, and hopefully the male tree monitor will be in there probably next weekend, once I get some plants and stuff in there.
Very cool. So, do you, just given the animals that you keep and the setups in general, are you going for bioactive or just naturalistic? You just want plants? Are you going full invertebrates and the whole nine? What's your goal there?
So for most of it, I do take like the naturalistic route. Like they're going bioactive. Because it gives me assurance colonies on the isopods. So like this enclosure behind me probably has well over 2,000 dairy cow isopods in it right now. All because I came home from a show one day and decided I didn't feel like unpacking them into the actual colony, so I just chucked the cup in there, and they've just exploded in numbers.
I did
but it's
the
also
same thing in a tortoise enclosure. it worked out amazingly.
But yeah, and so like every once in a while, like if I need to like boost the actual colony, like I just come in here, I grab a handful, throw them back in there. But it helps minimize cleaning from them. Also acts as a food diversity item for the gastros, enrichment, etc. It's a win all the way around. Because especially like the gastros, I don't think many people are doing it, but like they really enjoy like the prepared diets, like Pangea and stuff. And
really?
So I feed them up on the ledge there, and they'll eat it, but then they are food greedy little green demons, and so they push the cup off the ledge, and it falls onto the ground. And then like 2 days later, I'll pick it up, and it's perfectly clean because the isopods got to it.
Uh-oh. You went full robot mode.
Uh-oh.
Nope, I think now you're back.
Okay.
I think I got a little green peanut out of that, and you pointed over your shoulder.
Oh, yeah, little green demons. So I feed them Pangea up on the ledge. Yeah. But because they're so not aggressive, but they just push the cup.
Okay.
And eventually the cup goes over the ledge, and then when it's on the ground, the isopods just clean it out. So.
Nope, full robot again.
Uh-oh. Am I unfrozen now?
Yep, now you're back.
Okay.
So anyway, gastros and prepared diet. I'm sorry, I missed what you said.
Yeah, so it's a win-win with the isopods, because when the gastros are eating it, they eventually push the cup off the ledge, and then when it's on the ground, the isopods clean it out, and then it's one less food dish I actually have to scrub clean.
Nice. I can see that. And Chris says he could hear you fine, so maybe it might be on my end.
Oh, well, at least it's not my end then.
Right? And StreamYard isn't yelling at me, so I'm not totally sure. All right, well, that was fun. No, so it's clear on YouTube, no robot. All right, so then it's totally me. Thank you, everyone, for telling me it's my fault. Now, who knows? I don't know. StreamYard probably hates me at the moment. That's fine. So now, with going bioactive, so I use dwarf whites in a lot of stuff. Do you use those in anything?
Yeah, so all of our crested grow outs and holdbacks, while size appropriate, actually go in these little 8x8 by 12, I think, ish PVCs. And they all have like the dwarf whites and stuff in them. That's also what I use for grow out flying geckos as well. And so especially in those ones, like I'm seeding those all the time with dwarf whites because the flying gecko babies hunt them to no end. Yeah, so a lot of the like the Abronia enclosures, the Beresia, and all those all have tons of dwarf whites in them.
So dwarf whites freak a lot of people out that I see on social media because people think they're more protein dependent, or they could mess with eggs and things like that in the enclosure. Have you had any negative experiences with them, or do they work okay for you?
Not with dwarf whites. I've had, I don't recall which species off the top of my head, but when I was keeping the Malaysian cat geckos, I actually had the female had crashed. I'm assuming she must have been egg bound, and I didn't catch it in time.
Okay.
But by the time I found her, when I went to mist even the next day, like they had already chewed through her. But then when I was cleaning up the enclosure afterwards, I didn't think she had actually laid any eggs yet, but turns out she had laid like 12 of them in the enclosure.
Oh, okay.
And every single one of them had been eaten through.
Wow.
But some of them actually, you could make out like the skeletal remains of early embryonic development.
That sucks.
So I don't know if it was like the egg went bad and there ended up getting a hole in it, and then they ate through it. Because I know that everybody tends to say that isopods won't mess with eggs unless they go bad. Which I can't say that was or wasn't the case here. All I know, like I had a pile of gecko eggs, and then they all got chewed through apparently. And because like they were a species that like I was very hands off with, like they just had their own little forest in their enclosure, and I saw them when I watered and when I dropped crickets in, and that was pretty much it. And like they're definitely a species that I miss, but probably won't bring back in, at least not anytime soon. But yeah, as far as like other isopods go, I haven't really had any issues with the protein hungry shenanigans.
Okay.
And especially for the people that are concerned about that, an easy fix to that is buy some bug burger or grub pie and prepare a little bit of it every once in a while and just slap it on the ground in the enclosure. And that'll be gone in 2 days and they'll be satiated.
Right. So I actually have the same luck. So with morning geckos and dart frogs, they crush dwarf whites. They eat them like mad. Is it only the flying geckos that you've noticed that with, or do you have other things that have gone after the isopods? I know you said for the gastros that they seem to like it as well.
Yeah, so actually the reason that I started culturing isopods again a couple of years ago was as a food diversity item for juvenile Abronia.
Okay.
And so they really like them. So far, Ceratophora and their babies, they don't go after them too much, but when they spot them, they'll make the effort.
Okay.
Like the Abronia will like actively hunt them. Like if they feel movement underneath sphagnum, they will actively dig to find them. And then, yeah, as Mitch just pointed out, baby Lepidophyma love them. So I was always seeding their enclosure, and especially the babies. The adults, I have dairy cows in theirs, and I think some dwarf whites. But I also I don't see the adults out too often. Like I have to actually dig for them, or occasionally I'll just noodle for them. I'll stick my finger underneath the cork until one of them bites me, and then I can pull them out. And then most of the other like larger stuff I'll use just primarily the dairy cows with. Or if it's an enclosure that does get a little dirtier, I'll also like chuck dwarf whites in there too, so that way it's a smaller option that usually doesn't catch the animal's eyes if it's a larger animal. And because I've had enclosures like pluck basically bare pretty quickly with having like just dairy cows in there and stuff.
Right.
And especially like once you're used to bioactive enclosures, if the isopods or the cleanup crew in general die off, you notice it pretty quickly. And so especially like the enclosures that like I only had dairy cows and springtails in, if like all the dairy cows got eaten off or died, I noticed it pretty much within like days. It's like one of the enclosures is like one of our adult colonies of the flying geckos. Um, it's fairly heavily planted, but like the plant growth is really well, and so we constantly have some leaves dying off and dropping to the ground. And when the isopods are abundant, like those leaves don't last more than a day or two.
Oh, wow.
And there was at one point I had noticed I had some like grain mites that were like kind of hovering around. Um, and grain mites usually don't play well with isopods.
Right.
But if they're in small numbers, they're no biggie. So usually, like I don't bother too much with them if like they're not like everywhere. Um, and but like after I noticed them, like I know like the leaves like stopped disappearing, and I was like, I think this viv needs more isopods. And so I chucked another couple of handfuls of dairy cows in there, and within 2 or 3 days, like the grain mites basically disappeared, and all the leaves that had built up were all gone. And I was like, all right, so they're back to being happy. This tank's back in balance.
Right.
So there is still like some maintenance to them, kind of just paying attention to what's going on. But as far as like cleaning, I basically like for a lot of the bioactive enclosures, I try and refresh them like once, twice a year to make sure like the soil is happy, plants are happy.
Okay.
And what that looks like per enclosure kind of varies. Like yesterday, I spent the day refreshing a bunch of Abronia vivs, which is just pulling out all the substrate, giving them new mulch, new sphagnum, repotting plants that were in there, adding new plants. But then something like the flying gecko viv that has plants just running rampant in it, that like I kind of just churn the soil where I can, and then add a little bit of fresh like dry soil on top to help alleviate like any moisture buildup. But usually most of them, the drainage layers evaporate pretty well. Because I had one build probably around like 6 years ago now that I didn't leave like a airflow option for the drainage layer, and I learned very quickly from that build that not doing that and having a heavily misted enclosure very quickly leads to it smelling like sewage.
Yep.
Yeah. And so now I try to make sure I leave them all like a little port for the airflow. But for the most part, their maintenance is minimal, just paying attention every once in a while, refreshing, adding some new soil.
Right. So now, other than isopods, are you culturing feeders? Do you just buy feeders? What's your preference there?
So I have a dubia colony actually from Clint that I've been building up.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I had a couple of colonies, and then January of 2019, I think two of my older vivs, the sealer on the bottom of them decided it didn't want to survive any longer, and so the water that was built up in the bottom flooded the dubia colonies below, and they all died. And like that very day, like I had messaged Clint and I was like, hey, like my colony just got flooded, and he was like, I got you, and threw a handful into a tub and started raising a colony for me.
Awesome.
But right now, like especially with the Abronia and the tree monitors, if I tried feeding off from my colony, like it would be decimated within a week.
Right. Sure.
And so I'm just letting that build up, and eventually, hopefully, maybe splitting it at some point this year. So that way, hopefully, by the time we move or shortly thereafter, I'll be able to start actually feeding from that. Right now, the primary staple most of our stuff is on is crickets, which we get from Gons. Thankfully, significantly cheaper than we'd get them buying anywhere else for the quantity we do.
Right.
Because right now we get, I think our typical order is like 25,000 biweekly. Yeah, it's a lot. So as soon as we're able to just start feeding dubia and other roaches, it's going to be great.
For sure.
But I do culture fruit flies and stuff too for the smaller stuff, like all the ceratophora babies, the baby Lepidophyma, the morning geckos. Trying to think of what else eats them. Oh, the micro geckos and the frogs too.
I've had really good luck with bean beetles and rice flower beetles. I've been able to keep those going for quite a while. So.
Yeah, the rice flower beetles I had really good luck with, especially the larval form. The ceratophora babies really like them because they really like things that move in a wormy fashion. They absolutely love slugs, but I can't pluck small enough slugs in any reliable quantity out of our morning gecko vivs.
Right.
So those when I pluck the adults, I just give them to the ceratophora adults because like they'll eat them, no questions asked. But I'm hoping that at some point I'll be able to get the slugs culturing well enough outside of the morning viv, because right now I've tried it a couple times in different size containers and they just don't do as well as directly inside the viv. So I was like, all right, I'll leave you guys in there because the mornings also snack on the baby slugs too. So
yep. I have the exact same thing in the morning viv. I just have a little group of slugs that doing their own thing, and every now and again they get picked off here and there, and they just keep rocking. So I let them do what they're doing. So tons and tons of insects, obviously, and you had already talked a little bit about prepared diet. What does your supplementation look like?
So that varies a little bit by species. We try and kind of schedule it out. All of the crusteds are waking up and jumping around. But yeah, so we try and schedule it out a little bit. For the most part, at least once a week, we're dusting with vitamins, and then usually every other week, we're dusting with calcium. But we rotate through which calcium. We use pretty much exclusively the Repashy supplementations. So at least once a week, we're dusting with either Supervite or the Calcium Plus Lodi, since that has the vitamins in it as well. And then when we do the calcium, we rotate through the Super Cal, but with the varying amounts of the D3. So that way, especially like if we notice like a certain group of animals isn't spending as much time under the basking lights or under the UV lights, we'll give them insects dusted with the higher amounts of the D3. But yeah, so rotating through that, and then for most of the Abronia and stuff, we'll mix in bee pollen and super pig into the dusting as well. The super pig we give like maybe once a month or so, but we give that more frequently also to the frogs on the fruit flies.
Okay, cool. And did anything in particular drive you to Repashy? Just trial and error, and that's the best thing for you, or how did you arrive at that?
So back in my eublepharid days, everybody with Leos used to use like divionate and osteoform, and just blending it together at like a 4-to-1 ratio or whatever. And then I think around a year before I stopped with Leos and sold them off, Vionate had changed their formulation, not like significantly for the target species, but I noticed some decent changes in the leopard geckos at least. So I started looking at different options. I tried the Zoomeds, and that was okay. Everything seemed to keep pretty steady. But then, especially like the variety that Repashy offers to really like fine tune what you're supplementing and when.
For sure.
Plus, with having the wholesale account, because we also sell it, it was kind of a no-brainer to just get the big jugs of what we needed personally, and it just worked out well that way.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I love their stuff. It seems like kind of everybody, I don't know, if you started out back in the day, everybody sort of sampled and rotated and just arrived where they arrived in their own individual ways. But yeah, no, I love their stuff. I think it's done really well for me and most folks that I know.
Yeah, and I think for most of it, it tends to stick to the insects pretty well too, which I know like some of the other brands, like some do, some don't. Like the Vionate and Osteoform mix doesn't terribly well, but for Leo people, like they're just sprinkling it over mealworms in a bowl. which they're going to dive in and get some anyway. And that was one of the primary reasons too that I decided to switch from that, was because when we started keeping other stuff that was feeding on crickets and roaches, like it doesn't stick to them very well. So I was like, all right, so we got to figure out something else. And that's when I started kind of trial and error. And which, especially like in the day of social media where everybody can just join a group and ask like what everybody's using, don't be afraid to still trial and error within reason to find out what works best for you and your animals.
Absolutely.
Between supplementation, husbandry, etc. Like it was maybe 5-6 years ago that chameleon people were always like glass caging is the demon or the devil, screen caging 100%. And but like everybody's ambient conditions are different, and you have to account for that to figure out what sort of housing works best. And like I deal with the same thing with the Abronia. Like everybody like tries to be only screen caging, but most of ours are in PVC enclosures, or ones that I built that are kind of a hybrid between screen and PVC, and designed with the consideration of the airflow in that room and how the air circulates throughout like that area. And they're all doing great. So
awesome. Yeah, and that's kind of something I wanted to get into a little bit with you as well, on the husbandry side, and a little bit of the kind of like you were saying with social media, like it's not just a recipe for baking a cake. You know, there is trial and error and experimentation for things. So quite a few of the species that you have listed and talked about so far, there aren't necessarily great care sheet setups for these animals. You know, something like a flying gecko is heavily imported. Most people are not breeding them, you know, doing the captive bred thing. It's typically a wild caught, random first time pet somebody picks up at a table at a show because they're typically a lower end, you know, price wise. And then you get all the way to tree monitors and things like that, which even for monitor folks, you know, most, not all, but a fair chunk, Australian dwarfs, because they're little, they breed well. People like those. And then gigantic ones because they're gigantic. You know, even for tree monitors, it's only fairly recent that people have been pretty successive with breeding them. You know, they always came in imported and scrawny because they're scrawny anyway, and dehydrated. You know, there's always these issues with them. And so, I mean, how have you dealt with these animals I mean, obviously with the folks who are commenting in the chat, you know, you have other lizard nerd friends that you bounce things off of as well. But you know, how did you go about that? You know, I want to do flying geckos. Okay, well, you're not getting a Petco care sheet for flying geckos. I mean, are you diving in natural history? Are you Google Earth and stuff? Like, how do you go about deciding to build a gastro enclosure behind you and make it look like where gastros are from? You know, how did you go about that?
So typically my first stop for inspiration is if like I see a species that pops up on my radar, the first place I go is like the Herping the Globe group and searching for the species and seeing what in situ shots I can find. And then I save all those, start thinking about like what those conditions probably look like. And then I go onto Google Scholar while I'm on campus. So most of the articles are free. And I download every single one I can find on the genus or any species that are living close by. And especially like if I can find papers that mention like climate data, like I have probably well over probably approaching 500 papers, primarily just centric around like what I keep and the areas they're from. And I'm not going to claim that I've read them all. I skim them, or I open them in Control F and search for climate or keywords. But especially like ones that have like interesting titles that like stand out, like I'll go through and read. And like most of all of the Abronia literature, like I've read through probably all of that, and I try and keep as up to date as possible with all of that. And like the miss aspects that I have, like those as of last year were reclassified and grouped with Abronia. So I had people messaging me like, "Oh, did you realize this?" And I was like, "I have the paper downloaded, but have not yet read it." And I was like, "I'll get back to you when I have." um, but yeah, so like I try and keep on top of all that, and but like that's usually the big driving force behind. Like if something pops on my radar, like that's first stops is figuring all that out. Like not even I don't even try and look for care sheets at this point. Like, there was a time and day when I did, but at a point now where I'm the type of person that if somebody messages me wanting the simple recipe, I get annoyed. And because like I get the mindset, I do, but I also am the type of person that always encourages people to teach themselves.
Yeah.
And like especially like I've taught a handful of classes like between at Georgetown and then at my undergrad as well, and my focus was always to get the students to realize how to educate themselves, not just asking what's going to be on an exam so they can memorize the chapters in the book, but actually figuring out what the concepts are and critically thinking for themselves. And that's something that sadly is largely lacking in social media herpetoculture. Um, so when people message me now, like asking, like, "Oh, like, how do you do this?" And like, I'll message them once and be like, "Hey, like, these are the papers that I looked at," and usually I'll send them the PDF. But then if they message me like the same question, I, I have plenty of people sitting unread that I have to get back to at some point, and just be like, "I've sent you the papers, read them." Um, but like for some of the stuff that is more obscure or not as understood, like the flying geckos, I at least did kind of like cliff notes of what we do or what we did for establishing the wild caught animals up on the website. And then like the Ceratophora, I did a pretty detailed sheet on them. Um, but yeah, for the most, like I don't hate the idea of care sheets, but at the same time I do. Um, just it makes it so that like basically anything you can think of is a novice keeper can get the confidence that they can keep that thing successfully because they read a clip note care sheet.
Right.
And it's not doing justice to a lot of the species that are out there that have much more nuanced care.
Absolutely. I've always thought of a care sheet as like, I don't really know how to put that. Like if you read a care sheet, these are the minimum parameters to keep the animal from dying.
Yep.
Like I've just always thought like, so say you're an importer, right? In like the 70s and 80s in the heyday when just everything came in a bag and like crazy animals showed up, right? I to me, a care sheet was like the dude in Indo who sent you the crate, would also have a little sheet that said, here in Indo, this is what it feels and looks like. You should start here. And, just because when you open
Yeah.
the box in Alabama or whatever, like, now all right, cool. So I need to start here, get all these things to not die, and then go forward. I've just never understood like it always seemed like the baseline, and then a flying gecko comes to you, like you're the end user to me. Somebody imported it, you bought it, got to you. Like importer guy used one sheet, got it to eat and drink. It's a living gecko, it isn't dead yet.
Yeah.
Go. And and now you are supposed to go up from there and care for this thing. I've just never understood why we took the starter sheet and just that was it. Like it was just a very weird concept to me. I'm not sure how it became a cultural norm for us. I just thought it was very strange.
Yeah. And I think part of that is like social media, like really highlighting breeders and whatnot as well, which a lot of like the more industrial scale breeders are doing like the minimum to get animals to breed so that way they can sell them and profit and they can fulfill that pet niche
True.
in the hobby. But at the end of the day, like the end consumer needs to know how to allow that animal to thrive and not just having breeding be the measure of success. Um, and like I have this conversation all the time with Clint and Mitch in our group chat, um, and it's just something like it leaves kind of a foul taste in my mouth the way that herpetoculture has kind of progressed with social media and all the minimalism. But it's always a fresh breath of air when you go into groups like Advancing Herpetological Husbandry and realize there are still those gems in the rough that do genuinely want to do the best by their animals.
There's nerds
And
out
but
there.
I think, yeah, and I think people like that are in that group and doing hosting podcasts like this and stuff, like those are the people that we need spotlighting and really being the face of herpetoculture, not people with massive reticulated pythons shoved in enclosures. But that's another topic.
No, I mean I get it. It is a very stark difference, and I think that kind of that generates all those debates, right? Like, oh, I enclosures are stupid. I like tubs, or all you need is puppy pads. Bioactive people are idiots, or like all those debates that get generated. Hashtag highlight the nerds. Well done, sir. Um, but I just think that's how all those debates begin, right? Is like it. I've never understood that. Like I was just saying with the end user thing about a care sheet is whenever I have thought about keeping animals, like even when I was a kid, like keeping toads in my backyard or whatever, like when I did it, wherever I caught the toad, stream behind my grandma's house or whatever, like when I came home, I wanted to see that. Like I didn't just want to see a toad. I wanted to see a toad in the stream behind my grandma's house. And then so I wanted to make that at my house. And everybody that I've talked to when they were kids, like that's just kind of how they did stuff. Like, oh yeah, I put some grass in there and did like we all had the same idea. We just didn't know how to do it because we were young. And when we were younger, we didn't really have equipment that would have enabled us to do that. It's just really weird to me that we became 30 years old and had like real adult money to get lights and stuff.
And now
And
we're
then,
cutting every corner.
yeah. And I get it from the perspective of I could keep a ton of snakes or keep a ton of geckos and it is more efficient and so on and so forth. And that's absolutely true. And I understand. But when you get a person with a singular animal and then, well, what got you fascinated into this? And it's like, oh, well, I saw a turtle in a pond and I thought it was so cool, this, that, and the other. And it's like, well, then why do you have a red-eared slider in a 55-gallon tank? Like that isn't what fascinated you about this thing. Like, don't you want to do what you saw? It's like, oh yeah, but the pond thing is too big, or I don't have the space, or so on and so forth. And it's like, okay, totally understandable.
Pick a
I
different
get,
species.
yeah, exactly. Like I get it. Like I'm a big monitor and tegu dork. That's my thing. I like really big lizards because I can treat them like dogs and they act that way. And I do educational shows, so they're great because little kids like giant stuff. I only have like 5 because I don't have the space for multiple 8x4x4 enclosures, and I'm not going to keep them in smaller stuff because they're 40-inch lizards. Like I just don't do that. That I want a giant lizard so I can see it do giant lizard stuff, and it can't do it in a small space. I just never understood. I don't know. It's that debate's never going to go away. But that's also why, so far, and everyone that I have listed in the future as well, they're exactly like yourself. Everyone I've talked to has a similar something behind them as to what you have when I end up talking to them. And I think, especially with the bioactive thing, I think it's becoming much more prevalent, which is good. And it's kind of backhanded, because I think the reason it is becoming more prevalent is because we've made it like bulletproof. You can literally get an enclosure and the lights and order isopods, and you don't even have to make your own dirt anymore. You can order dirt, like and which is awesome, because if if our if the majority of our culture is going to be minimal effort, I don't want the animals to suffer for that. So fine, if we have to package it in a way that you will do well by the animal, then so be it. But I do think that that's helping more people get, I guess, to that level. That kind of sounds like a jerk way to say it, but whatever.
Yeah, like at least get to the point where they're starting to take the animal's welfare into more consideration
Yes.
than giving that bare minimum.
Yeah.
And like I've had, I made not mistake, but I made the error of posting one of our old leopard geckos on Instagram a week or so ago, and I've had messages like nonstop, like, "Oh, like, are you still working with them?" And I was like, "I haven't worked with eublephaриds in 5 years now," and like they are like, especially like being somebody that likes to remember like where I started and such, they are something that I do plan on adding back like once we have the space. But to me, like somebody was like, "Oh, you don't have space for a rack," and but I was like, to me, like they're going in 36 by 18 by 18 bioactive enclosures where like if eggs hatch, they hatch. Like I'm not going to pull and incubate them. And I've done it that way before for leopard geckos, and it works out fine. And especially like well-fed adults, like they're not going to attack the babies. And but like that's against like the norm. So people are like, "What do you mean? Like if the eggs hatch, they hatch?" And but like I'm at the point where like nature knows best, and I'm not going to shove a bunch of leopards in a rack that has 15 or 32 quart slots, which like the people that use that, like they have their place, like especially for the people that are producing in massive volumes, like John at Gecko Boa or Chris at Suburban Reptiles. Like they both are suburban geckos. They both produce like a large volume, and but they also are in there daily. Like it's what they do full time, making
Right.
sure those are clean and hygienic. Whereas I'm more of a hands-off keeper, so I want something that's going to take care of itself. And I stop by, I give it food, I make sure its water is fresh, and call it a day.
Yeah, I mean it's totally different styles for sure.
And because like, especially like one of my favorite species that I kept when I was keeping like all of that stuff was like the Eublepharus angermanu. And like they're massive animals, and like they don't deserve to be in anything less than a 36 by 18 by 18, in my opinion.
Right.
And even that, like with how big some of them get, like that can feel cramped for them as well.
For sure. Actually, since you just brought up the whole dropping off food and spending time, so two different rooms, a very diverse collection. How much time do you estimate you spend, like weekly or daily, with the number of animals that you have?
Um, so thankfully, my better half and I tag team it most of the time.
Okay.
So when we're cleaning or feeding, um, like for the cresteds at least, because like we still manually spray them. So I'll sit in the room while she's pulling down enclosures and giving them food, and I'll be pumping the sprayer and spraying them, checking nest boxes and stuff. Um, but like in total, we're probably between the two of us easily spending 40 to 60 hours in the rooms per week. primarily because I'll also just come in and sit and watch stuff.
Yep.
That, like the morning geckos, like every time I'm doing anything in that room, like I'll sit and watch them for a while. At this point, primarily to check and see if I spot any babies. Because for those, we almost whenever we spot them, we pull them and put them into a grow out enclosure. And then like the flying geckos, like I'll sit and watch them for a while. But also like assessing the enclosures to see like what needs to be pruned as far as plants go. One of the morning bibs I let go very feral without realizing it because a lot of the philodendrons were really crammed into the back corner. And I finally trimmed that 2 weeks ago ish and pulled around 26 feet worth of vining philodendrons out of it.
I remember that
an
post. That
18
was
by
insane.
18 by 24 exo.
That was awesome.
And so I had messaged my better half while she was at work, and I was like, "Hey, do any of your coworkers want any of this? I just pulled this much out of it." And she's like, "Pixar, it didn't happen." And so I draped it up over 3-foot enclosures that we had, and I was like, "That's 7 or 8 different vine clippings that are all roughly the length of those enclosures. So there you go. Whoever wants them, take them." And she was like, "There was that much in there," and I was like, "Apparently," and like that still barely made a dent in it. But yeah, so it like especially now that so for a while I had one of the smaller Miss King pumps, and I had 2 of them running in that room, but both of them were like well stretched beyond their capacity. But now I have the biggest one, and so it runs it all no problem, and the pressure difference and the actual volume difference is like the plants have gone absolutely nuts. Especially now that like things are starting to warm back up for this season.
Right.
So I'm gradually adjusting the temperatures, the photo period, and like one of the plants in the flying viv or the flying gecko viv, it like tripled in size in the last like 2 or 3 weeks to the point where like there was leaves trying to push out of the mesh on top. So I was like, all right, I guess I have to trim you, even though like they've been using the leaves as perch to nest or to rest right underneath the UV and sleep. And I was like, all right, like I'm gonna have to trim this though. They're not gonna be happy about it, but all right.
Yep.
So that's what I spent most of today doing. Actually, was pulling a bunch of clippings from various tanks and stuff.
Yeah, that's actually
which is a win-win. Yeah, it's a win-win because then like I get to root them and then I throw them in other enclosures, and then it's a vicious cycle because then it's just more that I have to clip. But I also, for some of them, I try and bring some plant like rooted clippings to the show that I vend as well. But otherwise, like when Clint comes out for the show, I'll usually send him back with a haul of plants, but he also usually shows up with a haul of plants for me. So it's kind of a net zero in that situation.
Yep. So where do you vend?
It's just a little show in Manassas, Virginia. It's about an hour drive from where we are currently, and usually right now my better half works every other Saturday, which is the day of the show. Which there's other shows that are kind of regional, but it's like since the primary thing that we produce for commercial purposes is the crusteds and mornings, which those sell well enough online, so I don't really need to worry about the show. We primarily go there to sell bugs and food. So we haven't really ventured out to do any other shows really. So
cool. So now for me, my whole family is involved in my stuff. You've mentioned your other half multiple times. Now, is that something where you were both into it and got together, or you're a lizard nerd and then that kind of by osmosis absorbed your other half?
I was definitely much more into it. So we met in undergrad, and she had a crested at the time, and I had some of my animals housed in the lab department. And so I would, because I used to do, I was TAing for comparative anatomy, so I would go in at night and host open labs so the students could come in and work on their dissections and identifications. And because I was usually there from think it was typically like 6 to 10 p.m. And so the room across the hall was where the leopard geckos and I had one other tank over there, I think. But so like around halfway through, or sometimes twice during the night, like I would bring out the leopards so that way people can interact with them, take like a mental break from staring at dead things, and actually get a burst of dopamine. But and so that was how we met. And then it was actually we had a tornado hit campus in upstate New York. Um,
Wow.
and the dorm that I was in was the only dorm on campus that had like reliable backup generators. And so she was like, "Hey, like, can I bring these over to your dorm so that way in case we lose power?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's fine." In the dorm as well. Which if anybody from campus is listening, no, I didn't, but I did. But yeah, thankfully, like my entire time there, like I had animals in the dorm and I had RAs that like didn't care and because like they weren't destructive. So,
Right.
um, but yeah. Um, and then so she's always kind of really liked the cresteds and the guards, and the water dragons and sailfins. And so when I started keeping a bunch of other stuff other than like the leopard geckos, to make it kind of self-sustainable, I had to try and think of like, what are we going to do breeding wise? So that way something can pay for all the obscure projects.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of getting a bunch of leopard geckos and sticking with that, we decided to do the cresteds because they're not as needy. You're not needing like extra heating elements and whatnot.
For sure.
And so it just kind of panned out. And like I still have plenty of people I talk to from my Leo days, and some of them know that I'm going to be pestering them in, like next year for stuff from them. Um, and but like the cresteds, like we've been really happy with how the projects have been progressing, and have made a couple of great friends within the crested community. Even though most of the crested community, like I'm not terribly active in it. Like I post in the groups every once in a while. But especially because like they're not my project, they're her
Sure.
thing, like they're what she likes. So like I don't engage with them too much. It's like if people want something, I'm like, here's the website, like there's where all the availability is. That's why I set it up.
Right.
And like it's been great so far, and Morph Market as well. Like a lot of people, um, most of the sales in the last probably year or probably a year and a half have primarily been through the website, but we do occasionally get the oddball hit off Morph Market that's not a tire kicker and actually commits. But yeah. Because like with Crested, a lot of people will ask like additional pictures and yada yada. Is it handleable? It's a gecko that jumps. Um, and like my default response at this point for like additional pictures is like we update photos monthly for what's available. Like if it's not sold by this date, there'll be another update. There'll be more pictures then. But especially because like I work in the lab full time, I do this the equivalent of full time, and also
Sure.
help run slash manage two nonprofits at this point that like I don't have spare time.
Right.
And what spare time I do have is usually spent in these rooms figuring out like where can be improved, what can do better, and at this point now also like planning out the facility, and how that's going to go.
Yeah, I get it. So, one thing I have heard from a lot of folks who breed and sell is that during the pandemic, uh, the internet sales were kicking for a lot of people, and they didn't. A lot of people were very upset, obviously, that there weren't shows, and were worried that there would be kind of a downturn in the market. And it seemed like that was not the case, and that on the internet side of sales, things were still cranking. I mean, have you noticed that? Or did things kind of stay the same? Or
For us, we don't release terribly much stuff. Like this year was or last year now, was our first year, with a lot of our like higher end stuff, like actually getting up to size and breeding finally. So a lot of that stuff like we held and grew out to see like so we could cherry pick female holdbacks and just see how things were developing in general. So that way like we've had some stuff that like we've priced ridiculously low over the last couple of years, and then looking at it now and like where the market's at, I was like, oh, like that could have been a $650 animal instead of 175. But like at the end of the day too, like it keeps customers happy, keeps them coming back. So like I like putting like the little gems in there like every once in a while. Like we've also gotten some great pickups that way from friends, like especially at shows too. Like we have one girl that's breeding this year for the first year that we got from a friend at a show for $60 because she didn't like how she thought she was developing, and she's phenomenal now. And we've had people message us and offer us several hundred for her. And I was like, nope, you can get babies. Thanks though.
Yeah.
And like I think especially now that certain markets are getting more international as well, like especially with the cresteds, there's a lot more prevalence of like buyers from over in Asia.
Really?
And a lot of the buyers over there, like they're not pushy, but like they know what they want. And so like when they see something that fits that kind of mold, like they don't hesitate to reach out and like, hey, is this for sale? And like there's a couple of our breeders that like I get messages about them like at least weekly, and then every time I post them, another flood of them come in, and I'm like, no, they're paired for the year, but you can get their babies. Thanks though.
Wow.
And like it's definitely nice like to have the attention of the international customers and whatnot. I know like some of my friends that do a lot of sales that way, like they've said like it can get tiring quick, which is fine and dandy because also like I have no problem just leaving somebody on red. Like at the end of the day, like it's not something that I'm doing to try and become a millionaire. Like
Right.
if they sell, they sell. If they're on the website, they're for sale. If they're not, they're not. Like I don't have some secret stash of stuff sitting around waiting for people to ask about it. Like especially like when we photograph stuff, like it's usually like we cup everything, photograph them, and do port checks where they're needed, usually all on the same day. And so it's usually like a several hour ordeal. And then looking through the images, realizing that, oh, hey, like you only got like maybe a quarter of a good image of a particular animal because they just were not sitting still.
Yep.
And it's like, it's a process. And like I know a lot of like newer keepers or people that are just getting into it, like don't realize that like aspect of sales. And it's like when they ask for additional photos, like part of me usually feels bad, like for telling like if it's not sold by this date, there'll be additional photos. Otherwise, like you can look at the other ones on the website, which are from like the previous updates if it's been on there for more than a month.
Right.
But like especially like for some of the stuff that like we have priced cheaper, like I don't have the time to pull out and photograph something that I have priced at like $100 because somebody wants 17 additional photos to see every angle of it. I try and take the photos to represent them as accurately as physically possible. And usually I try and make them look a little worse than they do in person. So that way people are happier when they receive them. And so far it's been great. And I haven't had any complaints.
I've actually never understood the 40 different angles for pictures on a lizard.
Neither have I.
Because like I don't just hold them like this and like what are you doing? Like it's not. I guess if you were hanging a piece of art on your wall where you could literally walk up to it and put your face on the painting, like yeah, maybe you want to go look at it, but like it's alive. It probably won't ever sit there so that you can see it in the Mona Lisa angle pose or like whatever you think is happening. I don't know. I've just never understood it. Like if you dig crested geckos and you like this color, that's pretty much it. Like I don't get that more in depth.
Like I get like from certain perspectives, like if people are looking for particular traits, and they like maybe want a close up of the pattern to see like if an additional color is present and whatnot. Or some cresteds have like kind of they call it like furred, where some scales along the side will actually be more pronounced and have the same kind of scalation as the crest on their head where it protrudes. So like if you're looking
Okay.
for a particular trait, that's fine and dandy, but communicate that. Don't be like, hey, can
Right.
I get like additional photos of all these angles? Like tell me what you're looking for and I'll tell you if it's present. And if it
Right.
is, then I'll maybe snap another pic to be like, yeah, see. But for the most part, like I try and make sure like everything, like if there's anything unique about an animal or whatever, like I try and make that represented in the photo collage that I put together for the website.
Right. So looking at your website and hearing you talk about your collection, you have a number of things that are, I guess, more established in herpetoculture. Like there's a market for crested geckos, right? So you kind of
Yeah.
know what you're working in, price points and lineages and things of that nature. When you start to get into the stranger things or more obscure things like flying geckos, um, like I don't I don't really understand hardly anything about the business side of herpetoculture, but like how do you generate price points for things that really just aren't available captive bred, or when they are, you probably know the two people who are making them available. Like it's very few people. Like how does it to you, or your thought process, you know, how do you invent the price of flying geckos? Like what does that look like for you?
So to me, like the first thing that I think about is like for, especially for things like flying geckos that are very often impulse purchases as fresh imports off tables at shows. Um, I try and think about like what price point would kind of shift that kind of atmosphere about that animal, to make it so that if people see them available at this price, they're less inclined to be like, "Oh, that's cheap. I'm bringing it home."
Okay.
But leave them like say, "Hey, I saw this. It's really cool, but I didn't want to drop that today. But I'm going to go home and research it." Uh, and like it's like for the flyers too, like I'm far from the first person that's produced them. One of the other people that are producing them very consistently, she is actually only a 40-minute drive away. um, and so for the flyers especially, like I chatted with her, said like, hey, like what are you pricing them at, individually, like in quantities, etc. Because like last year we exported together a group of I think like 17 up to Canada. And like that was great to see a fellow uh, hobbyist actually interested in not only importing them from us to their country as like as the species goes, instead of just looking for what is brought into their country, but exclusively looking to bring in captive bred individuals and willing to pay that price point
Right.
instead of being like, hey, like since I'm getting so many, can I get that wild caught price? Um, and so for the flyers, like
Which would
especially
mean
for
no.
small, yeah, which like they don't take a lot of work. Like they, we have like right now, I think we have we sit pretty steady. I think at around 20 eggs incubating at the enclosure at any given time.
That's awesome.
And I think last year we hatched uh, probably around 35 of them. And like we moved some at our shows, we sold a couple online, and then like a huge number of them went up to Canada. And then we still have some growing out. We sent Clint home with some. When he comes back in April, we'll be sending him home with more, whether he likes it or not. But the primary focus is like, especially for like that kind of stuff, is to make sure that other capable keepers have hardy individuals that they're more likely to see success with. So that way it's not people being like, hey, like I'm interested in them, but I don't want to take the gamble with wild caught. To give them that option, like if you're interested in them, you can buy captive bred. It's a little bit more, but not a lot more, and you're far more likely to see it actually survive.
Right.
Whereas like we've had like our actual adult colony of the Indonesian kulai, we got them all at the same time or very close to each other. It's a total of 1.3, and we didn't get any additional wild caughts. It was just them. We had 100% established rate, and we gave them a long time to bulk them up before we actually put them together, and it worked fantastic. And now they're breeding like rabbits. Um, and so I think, especially for stuff like that, like patience is key. Like, don't get stuff fresh off the import crate expecting it to just go straight in and breed like it never left the wild.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
some stuff can take years to actually acclimate and establish, get used to your weather patterns, your atmospheric pressure, the ambient conditions in your room or your enclosure. And sometimes it just never pans out. They just won't breed. But if you pay attention to the nuances, you can usually crack it.
Yeah, there's so many different species that like I will complain to my friends of like, oh man, I wish people would breed these, or like something like painted agamas. I'm a big nerd for painted agamas. And then I saw a couple of folks on some of the lizard groups that I'm in that were breeding them. And of course, captive bred ones are a little more expensive or what have you. And I was like, oh, yes, like I'm so glad that these people were breeding these. And then there seemed to be no interest for the person who had made them available. And now I was upset because I'm like, oh no, like I think these are awesome and this person is breeding them. Why don't all you people who thought they were awesome buy them from this person? Like you have, if that person cracked the code, we've got to make it worth their while to continue it because they're showing us the way. Like they figured it out. Now we need to reward them, and so that we can all benefit from it. Like it, yeah, that can be really frustrating. Where it's you get a handful of people, yourself and some other folks, especially with something kind of that was obscure like the flying geckos and is gaining popularity now. And it's like, no, man, you have to give those people your money. Like you just have to. But I mean, that's because they're going to go away. They're going to end up like blue day geckos. And the next time you see them, they're going to be $500. And everybody's going to go, why are they so expensive, man? When I was a kid, they were cheap. And it's like, yeah, because you didn't buy them from the guy. That's why.
Yeah. That's like, especially like even at our little local show, I've seen like one of the tables even is at the point where they're labeling the flying geckos as parachute geckos, and then in asterisk rare, and charging $20 more for fresh wild caughts, even though the other table that's the one actually importing them has them labeled as flying geckos or Cool's flying geckos, and they're the regular wild caught price.
Right.
And so we had a couple visit our table at one point that like they had noticed like the babies that we had on the table, and like I had them labeled with like Cool's flying gecko and Tydactylus parentheses gecko kulai, and like she like obviously like they were juveniles, and so people love small things, and like she let out an audible squee at them, and then the boyfriend was like, oh, the same thing's over at that other table for like a third of the price. And I was like, yeah, that's a fresh wild caught. This is captive bred, well established. And I was like, so if you want to take the gamble, I'll see you next show and you're back for these ones. And they circled around a couple times and they came back and they bought both the ones we had.
Yep.
And so like for a lot of that stuff, like I try not to bring any of like the obscure stuff to our show. Like I've brought the Lepidophyma. I moved I think like one or two at the show, and the last round of Stokeseye babies we had, I had moved I think like a surplus male at the show. But for the most part, like I don't like seeing stuff that won't do well going home as an impulse buy at a show.
Right. Yes.
Because that's like easily 50+% of what goes home from shows is impulse buys.
Right.
And I don't want to be a part of that problem.
Sure. And the kind of secondary to that is you don't know these people, and so you don't know what their price point is for an impulse buy. Because if like most people would think, wild caught stuff chilling in deli cups, like 15, 20, 25 bucks or whatever, people can just walk by and drop a 20 and keep walking. Like, you don't know if that person can walk by and drop a stack of 20s and keep walking. Like, that doesn't mean they're more educated. It's still an impulse purchase, even if it's a Ferrari. Like, that's,
like, oh, you walked in with your stimmy check ready to bring home like a green tree
right.
python?
Yeah.
But it was like you walk in and saw one and you're like, that's what I'm dropping my check on.
Right. I'm not saying that I'm not going to do that, but so man, we are at an hour and a half. We haven't talked about like a third of all the craziness that you keep. But is there anything in specific you think that we missed out on, or some just burgeoning news you have to get out to the world? Go to the website.
So one thing I'll say is that through Abronia Alliance, last year we hosted Abronia Ales and we raised I think just shy of $3,000 for the reserve in Guatemala, which was fantastic. We'll be hoping to do another one in August this year. We'll be meeting to solidify plans at some point in the near future once our schedules actually line up. Awesome. But I think tentatively we're aiming for August again. And yeah, so this year might also be a little more inclusive to just Cloud Forest in general, not necessarily just Abronia, because we're trying to actually get more of all of the network of everything involved in the ecosystem kind of involved, instead of just focusing on one genus that, like, yeah, they're a really cool species or group of lizards, but there's so much more to those habitats, and all of them are at risk.
For sure.
So we got thinking about it. We're like, why not highlight all of them? So that way it's hitting a bigger organic audience, getting more likely to get a higher number of people who genuinely care involved, instead of just a bunch of lizard people that are like, yeah, we keep cool lizards, which is great and all, but like at the end of the day, like we need to be contributing back to the environment, which is one of the big shifts that I kind of took around like 3 or 4 years ago now, where like now I'm at the point where like we have particular projects where we decided when we got them that 100% of that is going towards habitat protection and whatnot. So one of the ones we have that should kind of hit the ground running this year is the Chihuahua geckos from New Caledonia. I decided that while they're still like rising in popularity and their market's relatively stable, that we're at the point where like we'd like to be delegating several $1,000s a year from them exclusively to habitat protections and reserves and stuff.
Killer.
And so I'd like to see that become more commonplace in herpetoculture, especially with all of the big industry moguls that are getting tens of thousands of dollars from YouTube payouts.
If anyone was wondering, he's not talking about me. So no, hey, so when I share, when I post podcast episodes, I share that on the Facebook page. So for folks that are listening and people that are in the chat right now, when I share this episode on the Facebook page, the actual podcast episode, look in the comments on the Facebook page, and I will link the Abronia Alliance and then the Highlands and Islands Conservancy. And then I always share it whenever we find out what date Abronia Ales is. So that'll be on my page as well. But if you go to those pages, you'll be able to keep up to date with those things as well.
Yeah. So, I'm sure as we get plans more solidified, I can probably drag Nick on here for a roundtable too.
Killer. And speaking of the Abronia Ales, It's super early, but do you think it'll probably still be virtual?
So we were actually talking about it. Nothing set in stone yet. We'd like to do an in-person one if we can,
Okay.
just because we feel better energy and atmosphere being able to actually physically drink with everybody instead of just, hey,
Yeah.
cheers. Um, but we still have to obviously see how things pan out. If we
Right.
do an in-person one, it will likely be at the Reptile Preservation Institute down in Florida, at
Okay.
Cody and Pia's facility. But as we get more details fleshed out, I'll drag Nick on here and we can discuss it, as well as like our Brony Alliance in general, / in the direction we'd like to be heading.
For sure. Absolutely. So for those folks who are listening, please don't be discouraged when I ask if it's going to be virtual. It was still super awesome, and part of it being virtual meant that we were able to talk to folks who are actually down in those places. That was actually super cool. Um, it it would be wonderful to talk to them in person, but I wouldn't be able to talk to them in person where they live. They'd have to come up to the States and even go to RPI, which is killer. That'd be super cool, but that doesn't allow us to speak to this person where they're at and see where they're at and all of those things. So even when it's virtual, like you can really get a lot out of that. I thought it was awesome. Yeah, so definitely
It was
keep
definitely
tuned for
a
that.
great and fun event. Um, and like you said, like being virtual, like it had its drawbacks. But the fact that we were able to have Andreas actually call in and share experiences from herping and doing in field work down at the reserve
It was
was
cool.
fantastic. Um, and so I think especially if we're trying to be more inclusive to like all the species within those ecosystems and not even just limited to Central America's cloud forest, but like there's cloud forests in India and Sri Lanka and elsewhere in the world that all have pressures on them.
Right.
And so I think especially like if we're able to like even if we do an in-person event, there's more than likely going to be a virtual component to it, so that way people that aren't able to attend in person can still listen in live, and we'll be doing another auction and whatnot as well.
Okay.
But yeah, so that way so they don't have to add a flight to Florida to the ticket price basically.
Right.
Yeah. Right now, like the, hopefully that'll be like the outcome, that it'll be like in person but with the virtual component. But obviously like we want to keep everybody healthy and safe.
Sure. Absolutely.
But if things are going better tentatively, we were discussing potentially the week of Daytona at some point,
Okay.
doing it that week.
That'd be awesome. And for all of the Abronian nerds that are listening that happened to be at the last virtual event, if you saw a crocheted Tiger King in a video screen, that was me. So, I was bartending at a meadery and I played that on my laptop for myself at the bar and then set my little crocheted Tiger King on there and talked to a bunch of mead nerds about ales and weird lizards. So that's pretty sweet. But yeah, I will make sure you guys look in the comments. I will absolutely link that stuff. It's worth your time. It's worth checking out. They're really great organizations, and I don't know, man. Like it was a ton of cool people, like and a ton of dedicated people. So like I don't know, like you can just listen to people and tell that it's very important to them when they speak about some things and they're very passionate. And it was a very big deal to each of the people that spoke and the things that they were speaking about. And so it was very engaging. It's super educational. If you're not familiar with that part of the world or what is going on, it's a great way to learn about those things. And if you are familiar with it, uh, this level of nerdery will always make sure you learn something. So it's very much worth your time. So yeah, I will absolutely link and share all those things. So we'll get more people if we can.
Awesome.
Cool. All right, man. Well, that about wraps it up. So I really appreciate you talking to me, taking the time. You are a very, very busy person. So I'm grateful for it.
Yeah. Hopefully at some point that calms down.
Right? All right. Well, have a good night. Finish that beer, and we will talk to you later.
You too. Thanks for having me.
For sure. Bye.
Bye.